I've been through a lot with domestic violence, and I've started a nonprofit that I'm working on getting a domestic violence shelter and therapeutic horse farm up and running for both domestic violence victims as well as survivors, because there's not a lot of things out there that once you get out of the system that help you stay in connection with people that you really relate to.
Yes.
So,
It wasn't until recently that I actually realized that myself. I've been out of my my last relationship for about 4 years, and soon like your resources start to like dwindle away, and they consider you less important because there's other.
yep.
So then I've actually been devising different things in my head to come up with ways to fill in the blanks for survivors. Like you come into that 2-3 year point, you get dropped off from say
Yep.
YWCA, and you need new resources.
And there's actually, people don't realize this. Of course, people don't go through domestic violence, don't realize it, but it's not just the women that go through domestic violence that need the resources. Once you're out of domestic violence, there's still a lot of things you go through. There's a lot of women that go through PTSD. There's a lot of women who go through depression. Um, there's a lot of things that health problems, psychological problems, emotional problems that we still go through even after being out after this long. And there's very few resources out there that we can connect to get help.
Exactly. So can you tell me about where your initial ideas came from? When did you start your nonprofit?
When I actually started it in 2012 down in North Carolina, but I wanted to move it to New York because this not only is this my home state, this is where I went through all the domestic violence. And back then, there was nothing, absolutely nothing when I first started this for people who, women, men, even children, to discuss domestic violence, what was happening at home. It was basically you just looked the other way and didn't say anything. And then when I went to a shelter in Indiana, it was actually one of the better shelters I've ever been in. They had a system where there was two buildings. There was not just the shelter and transitional. You were directly connected to the police department with domestic violence detectives, and there was therapists, and there was art therapy, and there was a school for the kids. And it was just, I said that was the most awesome program I'd ever been in. And I started learning because when you're in domestic violence, the first thing you are is overwhelmed. There's so much that you're going through, and very little do people realize that once you get going through all that, you realize how little you really know. Um, and I'm the type of person, I don't like to know what I'm facing or what's out there. So I started putting myself through college. I started with my associates, and then I got my bachelor's in criminal justice and worked on my master's in psychology. And I started to realize that there's so much that women in domestic violence going through both domestic violence and survival don't know about their rights
Mm-hmm.
and what there is actually out there that they can do for themselves or ask questions. And I wanted to learn as much as I could. And as I was doing that, I was watching the people that worked in the shelter. And my one thought was, one day I'd heard one of the advocates um, talking to other advocates, and she was basically saying how she would never get in that position, and how nobody. And I had to stop, and I said, you know what? Advocates are very well educated, but those that don't go through domestic violence don't realize what you go through.
Mm-hmm.
So I stopped her and I said, first of all, you got to stop saying that you never. Because I said, if you look around the shelter, we have women who are lawyers, we have women who are wives of police officers, right down to just the basic person that was a homemaker that are going through domestic violence. So you can't say, I would never, because you don't know. Because domestic violence abusers, and this is something else I learned, hide very well their abuse until it's too late.
Mm-hmm.
Once they get you in that situation, they have you locked in. They ostracize you from your family, your friends, all your connections, and then the abuse starts. And then by the time you realize it, it's too late to run. And if you do run, you don't have any people to back you because they've all turned away because they don't realize why you turned away from them.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a lot of people who don't realize that there's very little resources out there, or more shelters have closed in the last 5, 10 years than ever. So we have less now than when we first started in domestic violence. And there is a huge amount of women that are going back to abuse and actually dying at the hands of their abusers because they have nowhere to go and nowhere to help them. And that is a very sad trend.
So then you
So
decided.
I came up with I wanted to start a shelter and I wanted to give back what I learned and to help those who were in the situation that I was in, but not just were and are, but also to start something for survivors where they can feel confident to come and talk and get resources and relate to others who are in the same spot that they've been in. And another thing I found out is that there's nothing therapeutic other than like an arts program or maybe music to really help the survivors and the victims. And I was watching a program on therapeutic horse farms, and I said, that's really something that needs to be attached with a domestic violence shelter. It gives them something that can calm them down and that they can relate to quietly without fear of retaliation. And that's how I came up with the domestic violence in the horse farm.
How far along is it?
I've got my state license, my nonprofit state license. Right now, I'm in the midst of going for my 501c3 for federal nonprofit status. And once we get that, we can start the grants process to get land and buildings and funding.
When do you start to do you have horses?
No, but I actually have a gentleman from down south. There's a rescue program for Mustangs from out west.
Really?
And you get the horses for free. They will transport them in as long as you're willing to house them and feed them and give them a good home. So I thought, well, why not help animals who need rescuing and us who also need rescuing? It's a good thing together.
Do you think that when you get your, say, I don't know if you call it a first batch, but your like first batch of horses, that this will be something that you'll continue, that if there's ever a horse in need, you can take it?
Yes.
Because
I think it works two ways. If you're giving back to society, you might as well give back to the animals because I love animals too. And animals really help and relate to humans.
Yes, they do.
And they help to calm. And I know you being in a domestic violence relationship too, the one thing that you want to do is be reassured.
Yes.
You want somewhere calm where someone's not screaming at you all the time, and that you can actually calm down. And I know when I first went to India, and I think I cried for like the first 2 weeks.
Yes.
And finally, I got to the point where I said, okay, now I have to take control of my life. And back then, of course, there was we've just started programs with housing for animals of domestic abusers that go through domestic violence, that the person who's abused that's coming to the shelter can actually have their animals housed and know that they're going to be okay and not end up thrown out in the cold or dead or abused or worse from their abusers that they leave.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a program that was really needed, and it's still in the infancy stages. There's a lot of places that still don't do that.
Have you thought about reaching out?
I think that was a well-needed program, and I think that that's something that all shelters should do, and I know that not all of them can, but it's something that is very well needed.
Have you thought about reaching out? Because I don't know if this is the same program that you were just talking about, but have you thought about reaching out to say the relationships that the dog have been abused to, then that dog can link up with an abused victim, and then they can form a bond?
Yes, I've thought about that. In fact, I have a Chihuahua that that came from an abused place, and he attached to me really quickly because I understood where he was coming from being abused.
Mm-hmm.
And if you take an animal who's being abused and you put it with someone who's been abused, they form a bond because they understand that both of them have been in a situation that neither of them could control.
Yes.
And so, yes, that is an excellent program, and I have thought about that.
Because I know, and I don't know if there's specific words, but there is some kind of, like, I don't know if it's hormonal, but when you're feeling upset or angry or anything, you can pet an animal, and that's somehow like it's a whole therapy in itself.
Therapeutic. Yep, it calms you down. It's been proven in hospitals. I have my nursing degree also, which I had long before I was in domestic violence.
You're just everywhere.
And it's been proven actually they bring animals in for children and adults in long-term care because they provide therapy and it calms people down.
Mhm.
And especially with children, it's something that they relate to. And like you see children in cancer facilities and stuff like that who really, really need the therapy and they need something to bond to, and that helps them. And it calms them down and allows the therapy to work better for them when they're calm.
Mhm. We actually have a program at Buff State where they bring in a dog every once in a while.
I thought about that.
During like finals and stuff.
That was my chihuahua, by the way, that you just heard.
Aw. So where do you see? Well, this is one of my
Still there?
favorite. What? Can you hear me?
Hello?
Can you hear me? Hello?
Hello?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I don't know what happened.
That was my chihuahua you heard, by the way. Yeah, it's been proven in therapy many times that animals help to calm humans down and humans relate to animals and help keep them calm. So it's very therapeutic.
So, like, what made you go for all these different kinds of education?
Well, the nursing I started when I was very first going through my first, I've been in 2 domestic violence marriages. The first marriage when I was right after I lost my mom died when I was 16, right after I lost my dad when I was 19. I decided I wanted to learn all I could about the problems that they suffered when they died, and so I went into nursing. And then when I went through my first domestic violence marriage, I had a lot of injuries and couldn't go out on the floor and work on the floor as a nurse. So the second one was even worse, and I ended up with more physical injuries. So then I decided, okay, I want to know all I could. So then I decided I was really interested in the legal side of what went on in domestic violence, because so many women walk into court and they feel overwhelmed and they feel like they're being looked down on, and there's not a lot of times when they have advocates with them. And so I thought, well, we need to understand what we're facing when we walk into a courtroom. What rights do we have? What are we going to go through? Because a lot of times they make us look like we're nuts and we don't understand what we're saying, and the abusers, the good person, we're the untrustable one.
Yes.
And that's why a lot of domestic violence women don't go to court, because they actually are made to feel worse than going through the abuse. So I wanted to learn all I could, and then as I was learning, I was more frustrated because I'm like, well, this is not a system that is working for domestic violence women. This is hindering us, not helping us. So I wanted to learn all I could, because I figured if a woman came and asked me, I could give them all the knowledge I knew and say, this is what we could do.
Mhm.
And that's one thing that needs to be done. We need to have counselors and everything. I know in the domestic violence shelter, I was the last one I was in. They had advocates that went with you to court, but many of them, so underfunded, don't have that program. And when you walk into the courtroom, it's just so overwhelming. Not only are you have to explain everything that went on, which is emotional enough, but then they make you feel like you were at fault.
Mhm.
So we need to get women out there that are educated, or at least have someone to go with them that's educated, that knows what they're going to face when they walk into a courtroom. Because a lot of domestic violence still today, with all that's known about domestic violence, a lot of people still don't report it.
I remember
for just that reason.
I know there's a lot of resources in Niagara and Erie County. There could be more, but there is most definitely advocates there for all different kinds of court cases and all that.
Yes. New York State, actually, I've been through, relocated to a lot of states, and New York State is actually one of the best with dealing with resources and all the different programs for domestic violence. Now, if you go down south, there's hardly any. In fact, they had a woman when I was down there in North Carolina that was coming to the domestic violence program, and as she got to the front doors, because she wasn't helped and wasn't explained that You can't just, you got to be very careful about coming here because he could follow you, whatever. She got to the doors and her abuser was right behind her and shot her and killed her.
Oh.
And they were shocked. And I'm like, why are you shocked? A lot of the abusers, if they find out that you're going for help, they're going to follow you and they're going to do whatever they can to stop you from getting it.
They don't want you to speak. They don't want you to speak.
Right. That it takes away their power. Once you start telling people what happened, it takes away their power over you. And they don't want to lose that power.
It can also be very therapeutic. Every time I talk about my experience, I feel like I've grown just a little bit more, no matter how many times I'm telling the exact same story.
Yep. Talking about, in fact, I have severe PTSD, so I still to this day go to counseling. And my counselor was like, I can't believe that you open up and talk about all this. And I'm like, that's the one thing that really helps. I said, the more times you tell your story, the more times you explain to people what happened, it gets easier and it's therapeutic and you feel better. And she's like, that's just a lot. And I'm like, yeah. And I said, the emotions still run high because I still, after telling everything, I break down and I cry, which is normal. And she's like, I can't believe that you can tell this and still, even through crying, that it's still this emotional. And I said, it will always be this emotional. I said, it's something that happened that was horrible. And I said, I wouldn't wish this on anybody ever.
Do you ever wish it on your abuser?
No. I wish that the last one, now, my first ex-husband actually got thrown in jail for a long time. Now, my second one is still, to this day, on the run. And somebody asked me one time what I would do if he ever walked up to me. And I said, well, the first thing I would probably do would grab the nearest cop and make sure that he goes to jail on the charges that are still out there. And they're like, no, you wouldn't. I said, they're like, you'd still be afraid. And I said, no, I'm not afraid, because the more therapy you go through, the more time goes by, you're still angry. And people tell me, you need to get over being angry. I don't think totally you ever get over being angry. Because there's times I know at night when I'll sit here and I'll think about everything that's happened and everything that I've gone through. And I get upset and I'm like, they didn't have the right to take all that from me. But then I said, well, if anything, I think that it's taught me to be a better person, because so many times you have people who walk by and they don't listen and they don't see and they don't pay attention to what's going on. You find a domestic violence person and they're the first one that pays attention to everything that's going on around them.
Yeah, you learn to be very perceptive.
Yep. I remember when I was in the shelter in Indiana, we had gone to a Pacers basketball game, and there was a couple in front of us. And he was just screaming at her. And he went to stand up to hit her, and my advocate grabbed me in time, but I was literally almost over the banister because I was going to grab a hold of him and say, And he's looking at me like I'm cracked, and I'm like, you're not going to hit her, and while I'm sitting here. And the cops came and they arrested him because he tried to assault her. But the guy just looked at me like I was crazy. I'm like, you don't understand. And the advocate's looking at him like, we have a bunch of domestic violence women in here. You really don't want to do that in front of them. You'll have all of them right on top of you. And I'm like, it's just an instant reaction. You just automatically, it's the first thing you think is, okay, I got to come to her rescue, or whoever's rescue. Could be a guy, it could be a child, but it's the first thing you think of. Now, you see people who turn and walk the other way and don't look. That's not us. We're the first ones to jump in.
Yes, no matter what.
Yep.
I had that specific occurrence. Like, I seen something happening in broad daylight, and I called 911, and I got pulled into it because I was witness.
Yep. And they look at you like you're crazy. Like, what are you doing? Do you want to be part of this? And you're like, you don't understand. I've already become part of this. This is who I used to be. I've gone through this. I'm trying to save somebody else from going through it. And they just look at you like you're nuts. And I've had cops ask me, why did you stop? And I'm like, because I've been there.
Mm-hmm.
I know what it feels like for somebody to turn around and look the other way, and you get the worst end of it.
Yes.
And I said, I don't want to see anybody go through that. Ever.
So what would you say that you learned in your criminal justice class that you might be able to lend out to the listeners now?
I think understanding is the biggest thing that you learn from all this. You learn to understand the other women, the other men, the other children. Any person who's been through domestic violence can relate to people in a way that a lot of people can't. We learn to be understanding and empathetic, and we actually can calm people down in situations where others can't because we know how to do it. We've been there. And a lot of people can't. A lot of people just turn around and say, okay, I can't do this, and walk away. The biggest mistake that you could do for a person in domestic violence is walk away.
Definitely.
Because you don't know if the next second they're going to be alive.
I completely agree with that. Did you learn anything in criminal justice? Do they teach you about anything to do with like child support and visitation and all of that?
Yes, they do. And they also teach you about the orders of protection, how to go through court if you're going by yourself, what to expect, what questions to ask, how to relate to like the judge or the DA. I was lucky in my second case. Well, actually both cases because my lawyer handled the first one, but the second case I was really lucky. I got a female DA and a female judge. And being females, they kind of related to who and what was going on. They didn't understand about the domestic violence, but they understood that this was a woman who had been through hell, and they were right there to help. A lot of judges don't do that, and a lot of lawyers don't even do that because they don't understand. They think it's a lot of emotional stuff that they don't need to get involved in, when that's the exact opposite. They need to get involved.
It just seems so messy for other people, and for the people that have gone through it, like we were just talking about, it's a no-brainer. You just step in, you help, because it's like, you know what it feels like on the other side, and other people don't. And then those are the people that are all like, oh, if I were in your shoes, I'd do this, this, and this. And in your head, you're like, no, you wouldn't. Like,
you've never been in that situation. How can you judge?
There's so many times I've been in a conversation with somebody, and I know that they wouldn't do exactly what they said that they would do if they were in that circumstance.
Right.
But
and it frustrates you.
Yes.
And that's my biggest thing. When you talk about this, and there's still even, I've had conversations with college professors. When you talk about this, they just look at you in a way like they have no understanding of what you're talking about. And they're just like, their first thing is, well, if I was, and you're like, but you can't say, well, if I was in this situation, because you haven't been. So you don't know what you're going to do in this situation. And God forbid you ever get in that situation, because it is one of the most horrible situations ever. So it's just, I get really frustrated when people say, and the other thing that I've had a lot of people ask me is, why did you stay for so long? Mm-hmm. And I'm like, you don't understand. A lot of these abusers threaten your family. They threaten your life. They threaten everything that you cherish. And that's the power that they have. And I'm just like, you don't understand. I said, nobody can answer, why did you stay? Because nobody really knows until they've been in it. Mm-hmm. I'm like, that is, when I was in Indiana, my advocate asked me to talk to one of the girls that was doing, college girls, was doing an article on domestic violence. And her first question was, well, why did you stay? And I said, that is something so hard to answer, because for each person it's different. But it's the same. Mm-hmm. I said, it's the same feeling. It's the same fear. It's the same. There's absolutely a sense of foreboding that you know that if you go to do anything, you're the one that's going to take the brunt end of it, and your family and your loved ones and your friends, anybody connected with you. And I'm like, so nobody can say, well, I wouldn't stay. I will do it. You don't know.
I was lucky enough to have people that I knew that I could feel that they wanted to give up, but I was lucky enough to have people that didn't give up.
Yep. And that's another thing people ask me because I talk to a lot of women online on Facebook, and they're like, why don't you just give up? Why don't you stop talking to this person? I said, because they need the help. And if you start talking to them, that's the time where they're going to end up dead or worse. I said they can end up in ICU. They can end up, and some women even kill themselves to get out of it. I said, you don't know the absolute worst it can get. We do. We've been there.
Definitely. So then, and this is one of my favorite questions to ask people, where do you see yourself in 5 years?
In 5 years, I hope to have my domestic violence shelter and therapeutic host farm up and running, and I would like to help as many women, children, men, whoever need the help in domestic violence. And it's not just domestic violence. A lot of women go through the sexual violence and everything that's attached to domestic violence. So I would like to help as many people in as many different areas as I can.
I think that's a really great goal. And a lot of the times you'll see that victims, it's after you've been through something like this, it's life altering, and then you start, like, it's so much easier to dream when you get your freedom back.
Yep, it is. And it took me a long time. When I first started my education, people were like, you can't do this. You'll never make it. And I used to look at them when I first started, it used to depress me. And now I just look at them and say, you know what? The more you tell me I can't, the more you want to push me to prove that I can.
Mm-hmm.
I said, huh?
Sorry, you can continue.
Oh, I said I had 2 abusers who told me I couldn't. And I said, there's nobody that's going to tell me I can't anymore.
Exactly. So you've owned yourself.
Yep. And that's the biggest, I think, the biggest hurdle, one of them, of domestic violence is getting yourself back. Getting to know who you are again after all the abuse.
Yes.
That is a big hurdle. Because you change so much during this whole process. And you find out that what used to be important to you isn't so important anymore. That there's now something that's more important.
Yeah. I can empathize with that.
Yep.
So, if you say there's a listener right now that isn't sure that she's necessarily going through dating violence or domestic violence, but I want to say that at 4:30 today, after we've been talking about it, I would hope that by now that you would understand after all the red flags that we've talked about. But if there was somebody out there right now that's listening and doesn't know exactly what her next moves, what kind of advice would you give her?
First of all, make sure that you have somebody to latch out to. If you have to call the domestic violence hotline, that they can give you the information on how to get away, but be safe. Be safe and make sure that you're providing for yourself. And if you have kids, that you have a plan to get away that's safe and it doesn't endanger yourself or your children. And leave, because it's never going to change. It's just going to get worse and worse, and until you end up dead or in the hospital.
I'm trying to look up quickly the hotlines that are around here.
I think there's a couple for domestic violence, and I think there's a couple for Haven House, which is a facility that gives resources here in Buffalo too. So,
well, the 24-hour, this is 24-hour, 7 days a week, domestic violence hotline in Erie County for help and shelter is 716-884-6000.
right.
They're located in Buffalo. And then I believe the number in Niagara County, you can call 716-433-1614. I could be wrong, but I'm going to make sure that I gave out the right numbers.
Okay.
Okay. So is there anything else that you think that you missed or maybe something else you wanted to cover?
I would say your next bet is just make sure that you call your family. Explain to them what's going on. Get as many people involved as you can, because the bigger support system you have, the better you're going to fare. There's always somebody out there that you can reach out to and that will help.
Okay, the number that I just previously gave, it was just a little bit mixed up. It's in Niagara County is 716-433-6716. Okay. I want to thank you so much for coming on the air.
Not a problem.
And it's amazing that you were available to be a part of Weekly Warriors.
Yes, it is. And we will have to keep in touch.
Yes, we will. I see a lot of different kinds of ways that we can connect and make both of our businesses prosper.
Yep.
Okay. Well, I'm going to go to a quick break, and then we will come back with music. Again, Betty, thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you, Jessica.
Have a great day.
Bye-bye. You too.